Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, December 11th, 2023, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. I am finally back home in Los Angeles. It's been such a doozy. I've been away for a year and a half. So much has changed over the past year and a half. I feel like I'm coming home a different person to a different home in some ways. So, yeah, it's an interesting journey we're all on. And I think there's a lot to reflect on here as 2023 comes to a close. We've got one more episode this year before we take hiatus. I always take 2 weeks off around the holidays to reset. And so next week, December 18th, will be our last episode of 2023. Before we do dive into this week's episode, I want to thank those of you who continue to support Talk Nerdy, to listen to the show. Gosh, we've been on since 2014. So next year will be our 10-year anniversary, which is bananas. Today's episode is episode 482. It's really hard to believe. We'll have to do something fun for 500. If you guys have any recommendations, I hope you'll hit me up on social media. And let me know, or just just reach out and let me know, because I'm super curious what you would like to hear for the 500th episode. Let's go ahead first and thank this week's patrons. Remember, Talk Nerdyism will always be 100% free to download. That's because I rely on the support of listeners just like you. I use Patreon as the platform. It's quick and easy. You can pledge your support on an episodic basis, as little as $1 a month. But I also have $1 an episode. I have people who pledge $50 an episode, which is just so incredibly generous. And that offsets the cost. Basically, it pays for production so that we don't have to charge per listener, which I think is a really cool model, very similar to, NPR or PBS. So this week's top patrons include Daniel Lang, as always, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so much from the bottom of my heart. Let's get into it. So this week I had the opportunity to chat with Dr. Sabine Stanley, who has a new book called What's Hidden Inside Planets. Sabine is a Bloomberg Distinguished Professor at Johns Hopkins University in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences and the Space Exploration Sector of the Applied Physics Lab. She's also the Vice Provost for Graduate and Professional Education at Johns Hopkins University, and she leads the Magnetism and Planetary Interiors, or MAGPI, or maybe it's Magpie, I'm not sure, research group. Her new book, like I just mentioned, is called What's Hidden Inside Planets. It's been available for a little less than a month now, so you can pick it up anywhere books are sold. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Sabine Stanley. Well, Sabine, thank you so much for joining me today.
So happy to be here.
I am excited to talk about your new book, What's Hidden Inside Planets. And you are not the first, physicist who I've had on the show, especially somebody who specializes in sort of planetary science. But I'm super curious because I always love to ask, at this point, I think we're like 500 episodes in. I've had different scientists from all walks of life who cover or who do a lot of different aspects of research. But I'm always super curious about your particular brand, because you are a physicist, but you have your own interests and you have your own sort of academic and life experiences that took you to the place you are today, namely at Johns Hopkins. And so I'm curious if maybe you can give us a little bit of background on sort of like why you study the things you study. What brought you to them?
Yeah, great question. So I kind of have a weird origin story. I actually grew up in an impact crater. So the town where I grew up is called Sudbury. It's in Ontario in northern Canada. And about 1.8 billion years ago, a giant asteroid hit the surface of the Earth at this location and made a giant hole that caused a bunch of material from deeper inside the Earth to come up close to the surface, bringing resources up. And people since then mined it, which caused the creation of this town. So I feel like I grew up in this place where like planets were being screamed at me from everywhere. And I just did not understand it at the time, but somehow my subconscious got it. So I like to think that somehow influenced me in thinking about planets, right? The place I grew up also, because of all the mining, it was essentially devoid of any vegetation at the time and had lots of rock exposures. And they actually sent Apollo astronauts to train there in the 60s to kind of learn about what the environment was going to be like on the moon. So it's kind of just this really interesting origin to kind of, I think this inspired me, but I didn't know about it. I totally didn't know about it. But then, got to high school kind of thing, was good in science and math, thought I wanted to be a doctor, then took a biology class where we had to dissect this hideous creature of some sort. And I was like, yeah, no, I'm out. And then I started actually watching Star Trek when I got home in the evenings. And I think that really inspired me with this idea of discovering new worlds out there, new planets, and kind of thinking about how different places can be. And I think that's what really inspired me to go into this field.
Oh, I love that. Did you sort of grow up in an environment, whether it be your parents or your teachers or just your community who really fostered kind of a love of science? Did it feel like this path was one that was supported along the way?
So I was a first generation college student.
Oh, okay.
I grew up in a wonderful family. They owned a restaurant. I grew up in a restaurant. So I was surrounded by food a lot. But not really any examples or role models of people in academia, for example, or in science at all. So that really hadn't crossed my path. When I was really young, actually, when I was like 8 to 10 years old, I thought I wanted to become a news broadcaster because it just seemed like at that time that these people on TV knew so much stuff to tell us, right? And I was like, okay, that's what I want to do. So I used to practice being like a news broadcaster. But it was sort of later in life when I started. I was very fortunate in high school, for example, to have an excellent mentor, actually not in science. It was my music teacher in high school. And I think that really inspired me on things like teaching. And then when I got to university, again, I was really fortunate to meet some great mentors who kind of helped me figure out what my path was and get me to kind of the experiences I needed to kind of figure out what I wanted to do.
Well, that's always really lovely to hear, especially for like women in fields where we're generally underrepresented. I think we're still seeing that. Like my field, psychology, has kind of the pendulum has swung the other direction, and even in biology, we're starting to see a shift in that way. But physics, computer science, some of the engineering, some of these fields, there's still a big struggle, especially at like the tippy top, right? Like the administrators,
yeah. So I have a story. So fun story. So. I went to an all-girls high school, right?
Oh,
so
interesting.
When in my like STEM classes, I was used to the fact that there were tons of women in my STEM classes and we were all smart and getting great grades, right? Like there was never any sort of, oh, you shouldn't be doing this kind of thing. But then I get my first day of university. I walk into my first year physics class and it's like this giant auditorium. It's got about 100 people in it. And I look around and my first thought is, why are all these men here? Because I was just shocked. Like there were probably 10 of us women in the room, right? The unfortunate thing is, so I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Toronto. And the first time I became a professor was also at the University of Toronto. And I ended up teaching this same class. And sadly, the gender ratio in this class was about the same when I was teaching it 15 to 20 years later as when I took it the first time. So that's something we really got to fix.
Oh, agree. And I'm curious, maybe not specifically with regards to the gender issue, but just in general, I think lots of times we have quite a few listeners, obviously, of the show. I'm based in Los Angeles, and we have quite a few listeners based in the United States, but I also have listeners from most English-speaking countries around the world, and even many countries where English is not the dominant language. So it's quite a kind of like diverse listenership of the show. And often there is a bit of an American lens, although I try really hard to be mindful of that. But I think sometimes we sort of lump North America in together, which might be valid and fair in certain contexts, but maybe not so much in others. And I'm just curious, you've worked in both countries. Your background was in Canada and then you came to the US. Do you notice any sort of differences in, I don't know, maybe it's like the gender dynamic in physics or just the culture, the ethic in academia? Do you notice any differences or is it pretty similar?
So there are similarities. I think some of the same issues that we struggle with here in the US in terms of representation in STEM fields and other things like that. Yes, that's not saved once you go to another country. So
Right.
we still experience that there. Canada, one thing that was a sort of a culture shock when I came to the US for me is just how hard it is to get into colleges here in the US, right?
Yeah.
We don't have SATs in Canada. We don't have anything like that. And college is affordable in Canada compared to the US, especially private institutions here in the US, right? So it's a completely different dynamic about going to university. I remember as a student going to university, you essentially, my friends and I, right, we would find places we want to go. If we had the grades, we got in, and, you would sometimes kind of decide on your pace through a university program. Maybe you thought in 1 year you'd only take 3 classes instead of 5, and that was okay because you could afford that, right?
Oh,
Here,
right.
I
And that's
think
all
it's
super prescribed here. Yeah.
yeah. So I think here it's a very different dynamic. It's like you've got this one shot at your education, and it's very expensive, so you better do it right. And that's somewhat of a difference that I notice in the U.S.
Yeah. Yeah. And how long have you been here in the States now?
So I did my PhD and postdoc in the States for I guess that was about 6 or 7 years when was that? In the early 2000s. And then now I've been back in the US for about 7 years.
Gotcha. And have you been at Johns Hopkins that whole time?
I have been, yes.
Yeah. Well, and so, in reading a little bit about you in preparation for this, not only was I reading about your research interests and obviously your writing, but also your interest in not just teaching, but mentoring and kind of some of the, I guess, administrative or higher level, like the things that as professors or as scientists come after you've been doing this a while. So it's not just about you and your work anymore. It's about sort of educating the next generation and fostering their creativity and their curiosity. And so I've been curious what that transition has been like for you, because I know that's sort of a rite of passage for a lot of individuals in academia.
Yeah, great question. So I think for the teaching front and the mentoring front, I've always loved to teach. It's when I was a teenager, I was teaching music already. It was just something I loved to do. So I was very excited about that aspect of academia, that I was going to be able to interact with students and help guide them in their learning process and see that growth, right? And you very much grow as a person when you're teaching something as well. So I've really enjoyed that. Mentoring, especially things like my graduate student, like when I do mentorship of graduate students, I feel like I get as much out of it that hopefully my students get out of it, right? It's just such a great dual learning experience. And nowadays, like my PhD students, my postdocs, they're just, they're amazing people. And I just love seeing them develop into these amazing humans and scientists, but they're also the way they think, right? This is a new generation and they think differently than I do. And there's something you can learn from that, right? So I feel like as long as everyone in a mentorship experience goes into the relationship with I want to grow mentality, that you can really get a lot out of that.
Yeah. I've been thinking about how to sort of structure the hour that we have together. And there's sort of 2 big prongs here. There's your newest book, which is sort of like a primer on planetary science, or just kind of giving us a really good introduction and a bit of a deep dive into planetary science. And then there's also your own kind of academic journey and your own research interests. And I'm curious, I guess maybe a good question to start would be, how much do they dovetail? Like, how much of your work were you able to write into your book?
Yeah, so quite a lot, actually. I think that I tried to frame the book in terms of, what are the things that I work on a lot that other people don't usually think of or realize, but are actually kind of important, right? So like if you just Google planets or planetary science, or you hear from NASA about the latest stuff, there's a lot of focus on things that happen kind of at the surface of planets, right? Is there life on Mars? Did so-and-so planet have an atmosphere? And those are very important questions. But I think what's exciting to me is that the answers to those questions are strongly related to what's going on deep inside a planet. And that's what I study, right? And it's kind of harder to study the inside of a planet because you do not have direct access, right? We cannot
Right.
Blow up Mars and look at the inside of it to figure out all the answers to the questions. So we have to be a little sneaky when we're studying the insides of planets. And I really love that challenge. But I love in this book that I was able to have an opportunity to kind of tell people, hey, do you like having a breathable atmosphere? here's why we have one, and here's why it's all thanks to what's going on inside the planet, right? Because I think it brings a new dimension when you show the connections between
Yeah.
everything that's happening on the surface and what goes on inside.
Absolutely. And so tell us maybe before we get too deep into the book itself about your own sort of academic research interests. Like, what were you studying for your dissertation, and how did that sort of evolve as you became a professor and kind of moved forward in your work?
So I'm really interested in how planets make their magnetic fields. So lots of planets, including Earth, have a magnetic field that surrounds us. This magnetic field is really important for shielding us against high energy particles that come from the sun. And that would be bad there, like high radiation if they hit the surface. So we have this like protective shield, but it's actually created, this magnetic field, it's created deep inside the Earth in the core. And so I actually use sort of the biggest computers out there in the world to try and simulate the processes that happen in the core of Earth and other planets to try and understand how they produce the field that we see. And there's lots of these really interesting questions. The time I was going through my PhD and onwards was really kind of a great time to be looking at magnetic fields because we were getting all this new data from these new missions that were going to planets and measuring magnetic fields. So it was sort of thing where like I'd start my PhD and we'd be like, yeah, we really know nothing about Mercury's magnetic field. And then like 3 or 4 years later, it would be like, we've gone and checked on what Mercury's magnetic field is like, and here's all the data on it. And so there was lots of new questions that we could explore, and I really enjoyed that. So I started in my PhD, I was working on a very particular problem about our two farthest planets in our solar system, Uranus and Neptune. They have really weird magnetic fields compared to the others in our solar system. And so I was trying to write codes that would simulate the magnetic fields and come up with a solution for why they're so different. Why are these planets so different? And so that was interesting. But then since then, I've basically kind of been hopping around the solar system, figuring out, okay, where's our new data coming from and what are the new questions for any planet that's out there? So I've written papers on Saturn, Jupiter, Mercury, Mars, the Moon, who am I forgetting? Earth, basically some asteroids, right? And then even exoplanets. So I think in my field, the place you want to be is where are we getting the newest data and how can we use that data to inform the work that we're doing.
And so, I'm curious, kind of putting the process on the shelf for a second and talking a little bit about the content is what's the similarity here? Like, do all of these planetary bodies produce these magnetic fields in sort of the same way? And there's just variation based on size or based on, if they're rocky or if they're gaseous? Or is there are there different processes involved for each of those different bodies that you just mentioned that you've kind of written about?
Yeah, so it's really interesting to me so it turns out that the processes are, in terms of the basic principles, like the physics, is the same, right? So, but it turns out that in order to create a magnetic field inside a planet by a process called a dynamo, you need to have three things. You need to have a good electrical conductor, so something that can conduct electricity. You need to be fluid or liquid, and you need to have motions. Okay. So if the key thing is that if you have enough motion in this electrically conducting fluid, you can generate magnetic fields through an induction process. So let's say now you go to some planet you didn't know. And so I'll give you a good example. Ganymede is a moon of Jupiter. The Galileo mission went there mid-90s, didn't know what to expect. And we measured that Ganymede has a magnetic field. And that immediately told us a bunch of stuff. It told us that Mercury has an iron core, that core is liquid, that the liquid is convecting, it's churning around to create this magnetic field. And that's information that's really hard to get in any other way. So what ends up happening is when you go to different planets and you see these different magnetic fields, you end up being able to infer stuff about the structure of the planet or the composition, right? So the reason we know that there are oceans on Europa, for example, is because of a magnetic induction signature. The reason we know that the core of Mercury is liquid is because it has a dynamo. It has this magnetic field. And so I like the fact that you can kind of use magnetic fields as like a probe. It's like a different kind of probe of what's going on deep in the interior to get information you just can't get any other ways.
Help me understand this term dynamo a little bit better, because it's so funny. I was actually just watching earlier this week the film The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind, about the basically middle school aged researcher, I guess you could call him that, inventor, in Malawi who built a solar generator in order to be able to bring a water pump to his village that was really struggling with a drought, and actually saved a lot of lives in doing so. And he needed to use an electrical dynamo, like the actual, like a machine, a dynamo. His teacher had one on his bike. Is it a similar concept to a planetary dynamo, or are these just two different uses of the same word?
No, it's a very similar concept. So take your bike light dynamo, right? So here's what a dynamo really describes. It's a conversion of energy from motion to electromagnetism. So your bike light, you're sitting on your bike, you're pedaling. The motion of the pedaling in the dynamo, in the little mechanism, causes currents to flow through a wire, which then light up your bike light. So your motion energy of your pedaling turns into light, electromagnetic energy. Similarly, with a generator, you might have a home generator, right? The motions of the engine convert that motion to electric energy that you can use in your house. Same in the cores of planets. The motions of the fluid, so the fluids inside Earth's core, for example, are churning around because the Earth is trying to cool down. Space is cold. The interiors of planets are hot, so they cool down. Just like if you put a pot of water on the stove, you're going to get motions, the boiling of the water. You get motions in the interior of the Earth as the core is convecting and trying to remove this heat. And those motions then convert into magnetic fields. So we transfer energy from the motions into the magnetic fields.
So it's kind of like a type of transduction, which is sort of the term that I'm more comfortable with from biology, right? Like turning, let's say, certain types of waves into a discernible signal, for example. Like basically just turning one form of energy into another form of energy.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what it is.
Okay. And so these dynamos inside the planets, does that then require that every single planet have a core, have some sort of molten liquid core?
So this is a great question. So if a planet has an active magnetic field, if we look at Earth, for example, we know there's this magnetic field surrounding us, then we know there must be an electrically conducting region in the interior. So then you have to kind of play a game of, well, what's the electrical conductor? And in the rocky planets like Earth, Mercury, Venus, Mars, the Moon, we have some information about what the composition of our interior is. And we know that we have an iron core at the center, and iron's a great conductor. So that's where we are generating our magnetic field. But then you get to some of the planets in the outer solar system. So take Jupiter and Saturn. There are these giant gas planets. They're mostly made up of hydrogen and helium, right? They might have a rocky core at the center. They might have an iron core at the center, but it's so buried deep inside that it cannot be explaining the magnetic field that we see at the surface. But if you think about what happens, and this is something I like to talk about in my book, is that hydrogen and helium, right? We kind of understand what they're like in our daily lives, right? Helium balloons, you're walking around, going to a birthday party. But if you take a material like hydrogen and helium and you put it under the immense pressure and the immense temperature that you experience inside planets, they become completely different beasts, right? They're not like the hydrogen and helium you know. So in Jupiter, for example, at about 10% of the way into the planet, hydrogen gets put under so much pressure that it becomes a metal. So it can conduct electricity. And so in Jupiter, the dynamo region is actually a metallic hydrogen region.
Interesting. So it's a completely different mechanism, but it gives, in some ways, the same result.
Exactly. Then you go out to Uranus and Neptune, my kind of favorite planets from my PhD, and there you do the same thing with water. We know there's probably a lot of water inside Uranus and Neptune. You ask what happens to water if you put it under really high pressure and really high temperature, and oh, look at that. It also conducts electricity. So you end up getting these interesting behaviors of materials when you expose them to different environments than we're used to.
So I'm curious, maybe this is a more complicated question than it sort of comes across as ostensibly, but how much of what we're discussing here, like maybe the difference between these outer kind of gas giants and these inner sort of rocky planets and the type of dynamo like we were talking about, how much of this is sort of theoretical and how much can we feel like we're pretty confident in saying that is how these things work?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think what we have from data are constraints. So for example, because of let's say the Juno mission, which is at Jupiter right now, the Juno mission can do things like measure the gravity field at Jupiter, and that can put constraints on the mass inside Jupiter, which puts constraints on kind of the structure of the planet. So then what we do is we use kind of our best information of what's inside planets to kind of match this gravity data, right? So every time we get new data, it's like we're adding more pieces to the puzzle, but we don't fully understand what the whole picture is yet. That's for sure. And I'll give you an example. So one of these fundamental questions in planetary formation has been about how does a planet the size of Jupiter form? And there's kind of two theories out there. One of them is that initially Jupiter formed the same way Earth would have formed or any of the other planets, in that a bunch of rocks and kind of heavier elements came together, and eventually you grow this like protoplanet that's a certain size. And for Jupiter, the theory was if you grew a rocky protoplanet to about 10 times the Earth's mass, then suddenly it would become massive enough to attract all the hydrogen gas around it, and then you would get this giant runaway growth into a giant gas planet like Jupiter. The other theory was that no, if you get enough gas together by itself, it'll gravitationally attract to itself and kind of just blip into a Jupiter altogether. So I'm simplifying a bit, but that's sort of the end member cases. And we didn't know what is the case with Jupiter. We had ideas and we had kind of preferences for one model or the other. And the data we've gotten from the Juno mission actually shows us that, well, it's kind of neither or both. So the interior, if you expected that the planet formed the first way, you would expect all the rocky stuff to be at the center, all the dense stuff to be at the center, and then all the hydrogen and helium to be on the outside. And that's not what we see. We actually see like what's being dubbed like a fuzzy core or a fuzzy planet, where a lot of the rock gets mixed in with the hydrogen as you go more and more outwards. So there's some details here that are really fundamental to what's going on inside the planet that we have not worked out yet. And that not only affects kind of how Jupiter forms, but it affects how all planets form, and it gives us it opens up new ideas for, these exoplanets we found, for example. How did they form? What do they look like on their insides?
Yeah. Gosh, that must be like so complicated, because even just the idea that an exoplanet exists is based on these little bits of evidence, right? And so trying to infer lots of information about what's happening on the inside based on like a little blip in light that we detected, or like that must be so
I'm
complex.
Awed by the people who build these instruments that can take these measurements that allow us to determine that there's a planet orbiting a star light years away from us. It's just fantastic. But it's really interesting how some of the basic principles, they're almost like the things you learn first when you start learning science. So, for example, right, the radial velocity technique is just straight from like Galileo's laws on how motion works and orbits and stuff like that. Kepler's laws, right? It's all Kepler and Galileo. Then you get to the transit method, where like if a planet passes in front of a star, it's going to dim the light of the star a bit, and we can see that in a spectrum. Like that's like, it's actually quite understandable. You don't have to get into fancy, weird theories of physics in order to get that, right? So we can get this information. It ends up being crucial to figuring out what the planet's made of, because as soon as you know the mass and you know the radius, you can get the density of the planet, right? And the density of the planet tells you, hey, is this like an Earth-like planet, or is it like a Jupiter-like planet? So right away, you're able to kind of differentiate into kind of end members of what kind of planet is this really. And so you already get to do a lot of work that way. I'm really excited because with JWST, this latest telescope, because it can measure compositions of the atmospheres of some of these planets so well, I think that's really a window into the interiors as well. Because on Earth, there's lots of interactions between the interior of Earth and the atmosphere. That's going to be true on exoplanets as well. So I think these measurements we're getting of what the atmospheres of these exoplanets are made of is going to tell us something about the interiors as well. So that's what I'm excited about.
So tell me a little bit more about that. Like, what are some of the things you're expecting or hoping to see, or hoping to maybe be surprised about?
Yeah. So I think one thing that has been really vexing, I'll call it a vexing question in planetary science, is how important is it for a planet to have a magnetic field to life? So how important is the magnetic field to making it a nice habitable place on the surface of the Earth? or any planet. And one of the hypotheses out there is that when a planet has a magnetic field, because it shields the planet's atmosphere from the solar wind, the planet can keep its atmosphere longer. So for example, take a planet like Mars. Mars doesn't have a very thick atmosphere. It's just got like a wispy atmosphere. And it doesn't have a magnetic field. And so when the solar wind coming from the sun hits Mars's atmosphere, the energy of the particles hitting the atmospheric particles can give them enough energy to escape the planet. So you get a lot more escape of atmosphere when you don't have a magnetic field, we think, right? So
that's the only reason?
So that's not the only, is what the only reason? Only reason for what?
What you were talking about, this sort of not lack of atmosphere, but that minimal or that escape of atmosphere. Is the magnetic field the dominant factor playing into that?
So this is an open question. We don't know. So in theory, it sounds great, right? It sounds like a completely reasonable theory. But, and there's a but here, if you look at other planets in our solar system, take Venus. Venus doesn't have a magnetic field, and it has a very thick atmosphere. So it's not a one-to-one sort of thing where planets with magnetic fields will have atmospheres and planets that don't have magnetic fields won't. But they're definitely related. It definitely impacts how gases escape the surface of a planet or the atmosphere of a planet if it has a magnetic field. So we need to understand that process better. And in fact, the MAVEN mission, which has been orbiting Mars and really studying atmospheric escape and the interaction with the magnetic field, has been trying to look at this too, right? It's also possible if a planet has a magnetic field. What the magnetic field actually does is it takes the solar wind particles, and because they're charged, it forces them to spiral along the magnetic field lines and head to the planet near the poles. So that's why, for example, we have aurora on Earth, is that high energy particles from the solar wind spinning around our magnetic field lines get close to the atmosphere at the poles. They interact with the atmosphere at the poles. That causes the light to be emitted that are the beautiful aurora we can see. And it's possible that on a planet, if you're bringing more solar wind particles concentrated in a region like the poles, maybe you're causing more atmospheric escape there, right? So we don't even know what sign is it good to have a magnetic field, or is it terrible to have a magnetic field when it comes to atmospheric loss? So that's kind of where we are at the moment. It's just a really hard problem to solve, but more data from more planets is going to be the way to get to an answer.
Okay, so that leads me, it might feel like a bit of a jump, but it leads me to a question. I remember when I was taking physics back in college that we had the option to take, if we were taking astronomy, for example, like, a cosmic version of physics, we had the option to take a planetary course or a stellar course, and everything felt very divided along those lines. But obviously stars, which are not planets, they are fundamentally different, also have these like massive magnetic fields. And so I'm curious, like, are they the same
That's
but
such
not?
a great question. So in fundamental principles, they're the same. The way that planets make magnetic fields is kind of, for most stars, is the same way that stars make magnetic fields. It's a dynamo process for stars inside the plasma-rich region of stars. What's interesting is that there are some, because of how stars work, like let's take our sun, okay? We've had observations of the sun's magnetic field for quite a while because we can see sunspots from the surface. Galileo had a telescope that could visualize sunspots, and you can actually track magnetic fields in sunspots. And so the observations we've had from the sun's magnetic field has been a really nice record for a long time. And what we know about the sun, for example, is that the sun's magnetic field flips polarity every 11 years, like clockwork. So what's the north magnetic pole becomes the south magnetic pole and vice versa. And that behavior, that periodic flipping of the field timed every 11 years, we do not see in planets that we're aware of. Admittedly, for some of the planets, we haven't been looking at them long enough to know if that's actually the case, but there's no sign of that. And so there's something different about the dynamics inside our sun than inside our planets. But it's likely to be a difference in some sort of parameter. It's the difference in the details, not a difference in the physics. It's kind of like if you have like a pendulum, right? And you treat a pendulum a certain way, you just kind of give it a small angle and you let it go, then the behavior of the pendulum is going to be very predictable. And we have nice equations that can explain how the pendulum works. But if you kind of take a pendulum and like throw it really hard or something, it's going to be different, right? So some of the parameters, the initial parameters of the system might be a different, to kind of put it in a different region of behavior than what we're used to. Just like wind can sometimes just cause a nice breeze, and other times it can cause a tornado. So it's really about the parameters of the system, how fast the speeds of things are, that kind of thing. That might be different inside stars compared to planets.
Okay, all right. And so is this like a pretty well agreed upon view?
So the short answer is no.
Mhm.
I mean, I think everyone agrees that planets and stars make their magnetic fields through dynamos, and it's in their interior. So in terms of that, yes, we agree. But we don't fully understand the mechanism that creates the 11-year cycle for the sun. We can't create numerical simulations, these computer simulations can't do it exactly the way the sun does. So there are some theories about how the sun does this very periodic 11-year thing, and people are still working on the details. It's really hard to do computer simulations of really turbulent fluids, so fluids that are moving really fast or have really small length scales. It just takes a lot of computational power. So it's really hard to do that, which is why we don't fully understand what's going on. But what's interesting for stars is it's actually easier to see other stars' magnetic fields than it is to see other planets' magnetic fields, because stars' magnetic fields end up being a lot stronger. And so we can actually detect them here at Earth. And so we have a whole bunch of data on other stars' magnetic fields. And so that helps us to kind of understand, again, the behaviors, the parameters, right? Is it that all stars that are like the sun, all G-type stars, or all stars of a certain age or size have the same magnetic field, or are they different? So people are starting to notice patterns, right? So it turns out that the type of magnetic field you have really depends on whether you spin fast or not. So we know that rotation is really important. The size of the star determines where the region where the dynamo can be. So smaller stars have the dynamo region near the surface, like in our sun, but much bigger stars have the dynamo region closer to the center. So sometimes we can't actually see the fields from that. So there's lots of things like that just being able to kind of sample this much larger data set of stars that have magnetic fields has helped us to answer questions.
So clearly you are well versed in stellar or solar astronomy as well, as I assume you'd have to be. But was I sort of misguided when I thought about that? And of course, it's an arbitrary distinction because most of these kind of categorical distinctions are arbitrary. But that there is sort of a line in the sand between planetary and like stellar astronomy, and that you've got sort of your stellar people and your planetary people.
Oh, you are absolutely 100% right about that. So whether it's courses you take or research fields or even what department we live in, you are either in like an astronomy department or you are in like an earth and planetary science department. There are some differences, right? There are some departments that mix, but for the most case, that's the scenario. What's interesting is that, a lot of those divisions, they're historical, right? It's how science used to be categorized, right? So you put all the biologists together in a biology department, you put all the chemists together in a chemistry department. And the trends you see nowadays are people really understand that no, everything is interdisciplinary. You need to understand what's going on in different fields to understand your system. And those were really artificial barriers of some sort. So for the stellar versus planetary dynamos, there's like if you're just interested in the fluid mechanics and the what are called magnetohydrodynamics of dynamo theory, you're just as happy studying stars as you are planets, right? That they're giving you information on the same type of process. So the process is the same, and there's no reason for us to live in different departments. But when you think about, what are the people around me who are doing work in a similar area kind of interested in, then in my Earth and Planetary Science department, they're interested in planets and Earth, right? There aren't really people in my department who study stars. But I go and talk to the astronomy and physics people as well. And I was in Canada, I was in a physics department rather than now in an Earth and Planetary Science department. So I think people are finding ways to bridge the boundaries, both in research. I think it still needs to work more in courses. Definitely, if you're an undergrad student and you're like, what course am I going to take? You're seeing stuff like Astronomy 101 or Intro to Planets, Intro to Earth 101 kind of stuff. You aren't seeing those interdisciplinary fronts as much as maybe we should be working on.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm reminded of when I was young and, wasn't sure where I wanted to put my efforts. And I was really interested in dinosaurs when I was a kid. I loved
Mhm.
dinosaurs. And I always thought I was going to grow up
Who
and become a
doesn't?
paleontologist. Yeah,
Yeah.
right? Because they're just so cool.
Yeah.
But I remember kind of feeling a little bit disillusioned when I discovered that most paleo departments are actually in like geology. Like most paleo kind of comes up through geology. And there's a couple of places, and it's probably different now, but at least, back when I was first looking into studying, there's a couple of places where it comes up through sort of comparative anatomy. So you see
Mhm,
it in the
mhm. Yep.
biology
Yep.
departments, but the vast majority, you were really having to get a geology degree in order to become a paleontologist. And I was like, but I'm not interested in that. And that was always really frustrating for me that historically interdisciplinary approaches to answering questions were harder to navigate. I do think we're seeing more universities sort of fostering interdisciplinary approaches and having these interesting opportunities for getting a degree that maybe you can mix and match your courses, or you can kind of be matrixed across multiple departments. But back in the day, it was sort of like, you got to do it the way we always did it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree with you 100%. And it's so interesting because I mean, I know people now who are geologists. And when I think about what their training is, for example, they're chemists or people who understand either biology, chemistry, physics, and they're just applying it to the study of Earth or rocks, right? So
Yeah.
it's so much more now to me, I think, really about the techniques. And like, so I think it's really important now if you're going through the system and trying to figure out what to learn, to start focusing on learning new skills and techniques and not to focus so much on the specific topic. I know that
Right.
sounds weird, right? Because what kind of gets us motivated or excited is a topic like dinosaurs. But really, what makes you make progress in a field is your ability to apply really cool techniques or really techniques from one discipline into another, because that's when you see big progress. When you jump a boundary like that, if you apply a technique that is only used, for example, in, I don't know, in genetics, in like medical labs, and then you say, why don't we try that on this dinosaur bone or something? Suddenly you get really new stuff. That's where you make the big leaps in science. So I think people should kind of open their minds more to learning the techniques and understanding that it's actually a little bit easier nowadays to jump fields than it used to be, right? It used to be you had to be the expert on dinosaurs and just focus on dinosaurs and that's all you can study. But probably now that cool thing you just discovered about how to analyze a dinosaur bone might have applications to studying the human genome, or who knows, right? So I think it's really interesting that we should be focusing on talking to each other more in the different fields, because that's where we're going to make the most progress.
Well, and I think that just that insight, that commentary brings us back full circle really nicely to your book and the way that you sort of structured your ideas in the book. And sort of when we first were sitting down for this conversation, I made some comment and I used very psychology terminology, which was like, let's put, because we often talk about content and process, but in a way it's sort of the same thing, right? It's like, what are the techniques? What are the methods versus the actual data or or let's say even the theories that we're developing based on that. And you can't have one without the other. They are inextricably linked, but it's that process itself that you so beautifully write about, that you highlight, which, gosh, I probably sound like a broken record at this point, but it's probably the 500th time I've said on the show that science is a process, and it's something we do. It's not just stuff we know.
Oh, that's so true. Yeah, 100%.
And I think you did a great job. I mean, was that very intentional when you sat down to write this book, that it was like, not so much what do we know, but how do we know what we know?
I don't know that it was that obvious to me that that's what it was, but I think I was thinking about what would make people excited. And I think a lot of the times we think about kids, right? The first thing kids ask, why? But why? Why? And so I think, how does that work? Why does that work? And so I wanted to focus on showing people that actually understanding how something works or why it is the way it is, that's understandable too. It's not just memorizing a bunch of facts about the interior of the earth, right? You can actually come up through logic with what we should expect if you understand how the process works. So yeah, so maybe it was intentional in that way, although I wouldn't have known to categorize it the way you just did from your psychology training.
And so, that sort of brings us to, to coming to a close on this hour. And I'm really curious. I always close my episodes by asking my guests the same two questions so we can reflect on these sort of big picture questions. But before we dive into that short segment, I'm just curious, I'm sure there's a ton, but is there anything that sticks out to you that we didn't talk about that you feel like, is important to at least mention?
Oh gosh, we covered a lot. I mean, I think I'll just throw this out there. So one thing I kind of loved about writing the book, was that I got to do a bunch of cool side projects as part of the book as well, and that involved, for example, a collaboration with a group of artists to kind of come up with an art show based on the content of my book. So I really think another thing that I really love is the intersection of science with other fields. So science and art, science and philosophy, science, pick your field. And it's amazing to me when I see people in these other fields that seem so different. It sounds so different, creative arts and science. But the processes are the same. If I think of how an artist works, it's the same way a scientist works, right? It's just amazing to see the connections. So that's something that I really got out of writing this book that I wasn't expecting.
Oh, I love that. Well, okay. Yeah, I'm thinking about my final two questions and whether that will play a role in them. But I'm super curious. So I always ask everybody on the show, and of course, all of the different people I interview come from all different walks of life, all different areas of interest. And so I'm always curious to see sort of the similarities, but also the differences in people's responses. So they're sort of big picture. Get ready for that and take all the time you need. But when you think about the future in whatever context feels relevant to you right now, so this could be obviously professional, or it could be personal, or some combination, and it could be kind of individualistic, communal, global, even in your case, cosmic. Number one, what is the thing that keeps you up the most at night? The thing that you are most concerned about? Maybe you're even struggling with some pessimism or even cynicism. And then on the flip side, to end on a more positive note, when you think about the future, where are you finding your hope, your optimism? What are you kind of genuinely looking forward to?
Those are some light questions to ask at the end.
Right. Yeah, just super easy. Just,
Yeah. So it's interesting. I think in terms of what keeps me up at night, and all, I guess the answer is kind of related. I love doing science. I love it, have always loved it. But I'm also at a position now where I recognize that because of my seniority, because I've been able to do some great science that people have appreciated, and because I've made connections in the field, that I actually have a chance now to have some impact on how science is done. And, I mean that everything from making the field more diverse to ensuring that we are training the next generation in the best way possible, to also solving some of the big problems in even, I guess, human dynamics now, right? So I end up finding that I'm getting more, I'm thinking a lot more, and I'm being kept up at night a lot more about the process of doing science and learning in general, and the connections to society, right? Like what is happening right now in universities, and how there's like this anti-truth mindset out there, and that, learning, this thought that learning is bad, like it just, that sort of stuff. I feel like I need to start putting some of my efforts more in that realm. Even though the science is what I love to do, I feel like I need to make it better for the next generation of folks to come up.
We can't do the science if we have that sort of pushback.
Exactly. Yeah. And so it's my time to get into the service mode. That's sort of how I've been feeling about it. So I hope to be able to continue doing some cool science, but I'm going to focus on really trying to make the next generation be able to do some cool science. And that leads to the second thing. Where's my optimism coming from? And it's from this next generation, right? I see my students, and they're amazing human beings, and they have these amazing dreams and thoughts about how things should be. And so that's where I see my hope.
I love that. Yeah. I mean, and how how fortunate to be able to be so connected to those individuals, because I think sometimes, um, or I know sometimes in speaking with individuals who are getting their connection with others through social media or through other forms of traditional media, or just, interpersonal exchanges, that um exactly what you were talking about, this sort of anti-science movement, or this concern around trust or around authority or pseudoscience, or and obviously we know throughout all of human history this has ebbed and flowed. But I think a lot of academics who get to be in the classroom or in the lab with young, excited, brilliant people have a perspective that those of us who don't have that kind of access might be missing, because our cynicism may be growing. And how wonderful that you have this like direct line to the hope and to the optimism and just to the promise of these individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel very fortunate to have that.
Ugh, love it. Well, gosh, Sabina, this has been such an incredible chat. I'm so grateful for you to sit down to teach us. There were a lot of kind of my burning questions were answered during this conversation. So thank you for taking my questions seriously and grappling with them for us.
No, thank you. This was lots of fun.
And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy. Again, the book is What's Hidden Inside Planets by Dr. Sabina Stanley. Thanks, everyone.